Thank you. Would any members of the panel would like to react to what was said by other members of the panel, participants of the panel? If not, the floor is yours. I would just ask for very short questions, not long developments, because there's a lot of people and we are short on times. Please, where is micros? Oh, that's okay.
Bartłomiej Nowak, Center for International
Proszę o
Relations.
przedstawienie się.
Bartłomiej Nowak, Center for International Relations. Mark, I read carefully. I must say it is fascinating to see your evolution of thought from the time when you wrote Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century until now. And I must say it's spectacular on the level of analyze, but it should stop on the level of analyze. When you look for your grand bargain, you are closer to the Metternich era than, I mean, where are the countries in between Europe and Russia? What's their place? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The neighbor, please.
Leszek Jażdżowski, editor-in-chief of Liberté magazine. I would like to ask you, is it possible in Europe to use a very basic economic term, economy of scale? We are talking about the crisis today, and all these numbers you're giving, that seems that, as was said here, we're biggest potential superpower. And I strongly believe that there is no, if we can choose between the retirement and being a superpower, then perhaps retirement is a nice offer. But we don't have this choice. So either we become a superpower or we become an insignificant peninsula in the West, as was said by the Chinese leader in the past. And my question is here for you. Is it possible to use arguments in the political public debates that will argue for European reason of state, European raison d'etat? I think this is something we need today, because I'm a strong supporter of foreign policy. But foreign policy must be for something. And I think there is a time for your generation, and our generation, I'm speaking, I mean, on behalf of students, which I'm not already, that we define what we need this Europe for today. Because we needed it for peace, and we achieved peace. We almost integrated the continent. But we have some answers, and I would like to ask you, do you see a political prospects? Because we need political actors arguing not in favor of nation-state interests, but in favor of European interests, and convince voters. And do you see it coming any time in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Lady there.
Karolina Wigura from Kultura Liberalna and Institute for Sociology, Warsaw University. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. I would like to ask a question about European citizen legitimization, meaning talking to Christoph Bertram, I heard his opinion about the origins of the European Union. I think he's not alone in this diagnosis. He said, well, for the older generations of Europeans, it's quite clear that the beginning of the European Union is a trial to integrate Germany more into the European community, to make it more peaceful. But for the new generations of Europeans, this legitimization is quite abstract. They do not understand it. So what we are lacking today is a new point, a new center of legitimization for European Union, and this lack is affecting, in my opinion, the efficiency of Europe as a project on the world stage. Some of the remedia which were given by European intellectuals were, for example, referenda, like, for example, Jürgen Habermas was saying that it would be important to organize European referenda, but we all know that they are absent. We don't have any referendas, except for these that are unsuccessful. So this is the question, not for any particular participant of the panel, but perhaps for all the participants, the question about legitimization for the new generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please, gentlemen.
Maciej Pikiewicz, PhD, Warsaw School of Economics. Here was mentioned by the president and the minister and other speakers the question of Africa. Therefore, I would like to ask a certain short question. I've been in Algeria, Senegal, and so on, but I would like to find out of your opinion the impact of the African Revolution on Europe. That is a certain question that I would like to ask the gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman behind here.
Tim Bose, German History Institute in Warsaw. I just would like to say that I think a better integration in foreign policy on the European level just works when we start a discussion about European citizenship, and I think these two discussions are pretty much related. And I think the discussion about the structure of European civil society is pretty much related as well with foreign policy issues. And there was another point I would like to criticize Mr. Sikorski, because you were talking about cultural incompatible countries, and I think it's just not the right term of talking about like different cultures in this way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Lucas Beerski from the Dutch Embassy, but I wouldn't like to ask the question on behalf of the Dutch government, rather from my Indian perspective as a person that was born in India. I think a lot of questions and issues that you mentioned are obvious for any Indian. India as a civilization state. My question is, I think in Europe we have a civilizations, but we don't have a state. Do you think we need to have a state in order to have this common foreign policy strengthened, and etc.? Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen there.
Łukasz Pawłowski, Institute of Sociology
Yes,
and Kultura Liberalna magazine. I want to introduce a bit more parochial perspective, and I have a question to Minister Sikorski about immigration policy, because you said that the better solution is to create the good conditions for the people who live abroad, and instead of taking them in, but creating good conditions for them there takes a lot of time, and it's not always successful, as we have seen. And I mean Poland as well, we need them now. And so my question is, would you advocate some change in Polish immigration policy, or would you let it stay as it is right now, which means non-existent, or yes, basically non-existent?
Marcin Święcicki. Actually, I have a few questions. One question is, that following our predecessors, that the current structure of taking decisions in Europe is very ineffective in view of the US, China, India, and very often small interest of some lobbyists are taking over the interest of Europe. Let me give you a few examples. Sales of weapons to China against Taiwan and democracy in Taiwan. The interest of the European farmers against Ukrainian agriculture. The EU is proposing a new trade agreement with Ukraine, but 5% of production is to be excluded, actually agricultural one, and Europe prefers to support our farmers, even the most ineffective, even in the mountains area, to pay high subsidies to them, instead of incorporating black soils in Ukraine, the most fertile soils Europe has, and to produce cheaper and more differentiated food for European consumer. Turkey. Why in Turkey the interest in integration with EU is just falling down and Europe is losing it? So my question is whether you as this European Council, are you also thinking about the way of taking decisions in Europe? Because sometimes I see that, for example, European Parliament is much more closer to represent the interests of European citizens and somehow has more vision than the small interests like I don't know, Ireland that can block all the Lisbon Treaty. One small country with a small majority can block or not block. We are waiting for this. So I'm just afraid that Europe in its internal structure is so inefficient that without reforming this, we will not be able to face all these challenges and to be a global player.
Marcin, could you pass to gentleman there? Yeah.
Paweł Hincha, graduate of Warsaw University and College of Europe. I have two questions related to words spoken by Mr. Krastev and Mr. Sikorski. You said that Europe should avoid the status of commentator, should be like an actor, and Mr. Sikorski said that Europe should act as an imperial power. I have a question: how Europe can act like this and avoid being a commentator if Europe, although has altogether 2 million soldiers, does not have like a military base in Bahrain and cannot influence the revolution there like US did? How can Europe influence revolution in Libya if, like Italy, refuses to accept some immigrants from Tunisia, for example, now, and Frontex acts like a barrier to Europe and not like a common European border guard? And how can Europe act like imperial power if it secures, as my predecessor said, interests of European agriculturers, farmers, and refuses to sign a good treaty with Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman here and afterwards.
Chciałbym zadać sobie pytanie w języku polskim, jeśli Państwo pozwolą. Dotyczące pytania do pana ministra Sikorskiego. Ukraiński internet-portal Obозреватель. Polityka zagraniczna przyciągnięcia dyktatora Łukaszenki przez ostatnich 2 lata nie dała rezultatu. Usłyszeliśmy niedawno wyrok 4 lata opozycjonista, który uczestniczył w manifestacji wyborczej 19 grudnia. Takich wyroków będzie kilka, może kilkanaście. Jakie będą kroki Zachodu wobec białoruskiego reżimu i czy może białoruskie społeczeństwo oczekiwać jakichś sankcji ekonomicznych między innymi? Dziękuję.
My name is Anna Skolimowska and I represent Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University from Warsaw, and I would like to ask a question to Foreign Minister Mr. Sikorski. And this question is one more philosophical one and the second is more practical one. So let me start with the philosophical one. In Europe we've got a huge debate concerning the question whether it is still a community of values or only a community of interest. How can we answer this question in the context of European foreign relations? And this is this philosophical one, and the practical, I would like to know whether if the European Union Council for Foreign Relations was able to agree a common response for the Christian persecutions today on its meeting in Brussels. So thank you very much in advance for your kind answers. Thank you
very much.
Bogdan Oppenheim, Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles. Jak odwiedzam Polskę, wolę po polsku mówić. Ciekawi mnie...
But if you can speak in English...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, perfect. I'm interested in the relationship between the Council, European Council for Foreign Relations, and the American Council. Do you see a certain degree of competitiveness there? Is there a strategy of cooperation? Are there any formal plans for links, for common conferences, debates, and so on? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
My name is Michaela. I'm biochemistry. My question is on future of U.S. missiles and weapons in Europe. There is 200 nuclear weapons in Europe. What is your take on it?
Thank you very much. There I can see a gentleman here.
Maciej Białek, Institute of Law and Administration, and I have two questions. One has already been mentioned. Well, among these goals or ideas here, you have fighting the global poverty. And my question is, can it really be done when the Europe agricultural market looks as it looks like now? And the second one is that, well, you mentioned here that in case of inefficiency of other means, Europe should be ready to use its military force in order to prevent genocides, not only in Europe but among all the world. And my question is, how does it relate to the problem of North Korea? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman, please.
Zbigniew Pisarski from Pulaski Foundation. I have a question to all the panel, maybe except Mr. Sikorski, because he might be maybe not comfortable answering this question. What is your opinion about the European Minister of Foreign Relations, so-called? Baroness Catherine Ashton. What is your opinion about her qualifications and efficiency? And maybe we as a Europe, and as we are discussing today about foreign relations, select someone more competent, like Mr. Sikorski, or maybe Aleksander Kwaśniewski, or all the other statements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I cannot see any more questions. Oh, there is one, the last one. Yes, please.
My name is Krzysztof Korzępa, and I've got two questions to Minister Sikorski. My first question is on behalf of many young people in Poland. Mr. Minister, you like talking a lot about human rights and citizen rights. One of the basic citizen rights is the right for an equal access to the job market, to the labor market and employment. My question is, what do you think about nepotism and favoritism problem in Poland? And what is the scale of this problem in the public administration in our country? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will close this part. Now, what? Somebody else? Yes, please. The last one.
Yeah, thank you. Wojciech Przybylski of Republika Nowa. My question is referring to, I believe, sort of what my colleague has been already asking, that the Europe, as you presented, unites only in a negative way, that is a response to some crisis. But do you foresee in the future a positive a horizon for change, a positive horizon for Europe? And would that be a goal to seek one in the ECFR? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the member of the panels will answer in the reversed way, with one exception, Minister Sikorski, who must leave us, so he will be the first to answer the question. Please.
Thank you. I agree with the gentleman in the red jumper that nepotism is a very bad thing, and that people should have fair access to jobs in the public sector in particular. That's why even when I was deputy minister over 10 years ago, I introduced the first open competitions to become heads of Polish institutes abroad, for example. And that's why we have created a civil service where a politician like myself doesn't decide the appointments in the civil service. I still have some influence in deciding the appointments to be ambassador, shared with the Prime Minister and the President. But as regards appointment in the civil service, it's always by competition, by law. Out of the but at the same time, a system has been created so that politicians can employ a couple of advisors, people close to themselves, that they can just appoint without this competitive system so that they are not tempted to skew the appointment process in the civil service. And I believe most countries have that system. I think in the British system you have the civil service, but also the special advisor to the minister, one or two. Most ministers have these special advisors, which in the Polish system are called the political cabinet. And some people have up to 10 of such advisors. I have 3. So out of the 3,500 people that I'm responsible for, there are 3 people that I appoint without competition. And this is because these are people that I trust, these are the people I want to work for them. And so these 3 people, yes, I have appointed by law on the basis of my personal judgment. Other than that, it's all competition. I hope that satisfies you. My assessment of Cathy Ashton, she gets better with every month, I have to say. She has an impossible job. She imagined to have to run the emergent foreign policy of 27 nations that you need to synchronize and represent, while at the same time having to create your foreign ministry from scratch. It's an impossible job, and we should give her every encouragement in it. And I have particular reasons to be pleased, of course, because despite the hysteria in some sections of the Polish press, we now actually have a poll in the 4-person directorate, which is now run by a Brit, a German, a Frenchman, and a Pole. So we have reasons to be grateful to Cathy Ashton, and the very fact that there is now a permanent chairman of the Foreign Affairs Council is already making it work better, because we now have briefings on, for example, so if there is a discussion on Egypt, first you have the commissioner telling you what kind of money we are spending in Egypt, what our policy is. Then we have a discussion, then she sums up. It sounds straightforward and simple, but trust me, it wasn't always like that before. So I'd like to persuade you that it's better than before and getting better with every passing month. But I would like it to be remembered that when we chose the High Representative for the first time, I fielded a non-paper to the European Council telling our heads of state and government to hold hearings, to have candidates, have hearings, and then to appoint someone, rather than do it by political fiat. My yardstick for the European Union is not a very ambitious one. I believe that the European Union should be no less democratic than the State of Vatican. And at the Vatican, as you know, they actually elect their head of state by a democratic vote, which we in the European Union don't. And it's a shame. As regards fighting global poverty and CAP, well, that's a big discussion. Agricultural prices have risen, so I do believe that there is less and less of an argument for maintaining agricultural prices, and more for supporting the state of the countryside and improving the state of the countryside. And that's slowly, too slowly, but that's where the common agricultural policy is going, and I'm happy to say that we would have some vested interest in supporting the old CAP, but nevertheless, our agriculture minister in Poland supports the evolution of CAP in that direction. As regards using military power towards North Korea, steady on. We have conducted about 24 military operations as Europe, but they have been pretty small, we've done. And Poland has taken part in most of them. Congo, Chad, Somalia, off the coast of Somalia, Balkans. We don't even have an operations headquarter or a general headquarter because it's too controversial for some countries. So first we need proper planning and command and control facilities, and we'll probably have to go towards so-called reinforced cooperation, which means a coalition of the willing to achieve that. And even when we have that, it'll be many, I would say decades yet before we are able to act globally, if ever. North Korea is an issue that the United States can't solve, let alone us. Poland actually has some residual role. We are a member of the Neutral States Supervisory Commission on the northern North Korean peninsula. When it was set up in 1953, as a result of the armistice, we of course were a neutral state. 200 US nuclear weapons in Europe, what future for them? Let's not discriminate against the US nuclear weapons. There are some other tactical nuclear weapons in Europe as well, you know, and we don't even know how many there are. Which is why Poland and Norway has proposed a non-paper which has actually been accepted and digested by the NATO summit in Tallinn, namely that we should have a process first of transparency. We believe that Russia has at least 2,000 tactical nukes in Europe, at least, so 10 times more than the United States. And then if you care about removing nuclear weapons, at least from Europe, then surely the US stock is a chip that we should use to get the Russian Federation to do its bit to rid Europe of nuclear weapons. So it should be a process of first transparency, then confidence building, inspections and so on, and then possible removal out of Europe. So Poland is very much in favor of this process, but it has to be equivocal, has to be mutual. Our friend from the Cardinal Wyszynski University asks us whether Europe is still a community of values. I think, yeah, but not necessarily religious values. I mean, I think we still believe in democracy, I wish we had made more of our strong commitment to the value of free speech during the crisis over the Danish caricatures, for example. Because actually that was an issue on which the church and civil society could act just like they did in Poland some decades ago, in unison, because we all care these days about free speech. So I think Europe has values, but they're post-religious mostly. As regards the persecution of Christians, now that's a different issue. When people are being murdered, and they are, and some countries are being cleansed of Christians, for example in Iraq, the least that we can do is to say it, is to name the problem. I believe we should do much more. But trust me, we had trouble with Italy and a couple of other kindred countries to get others to even name the problem, that there is persecution of Christians. I kept looking at my BlackBerry because I don't yet have a report from today's Foreign Affairs Council, so I don't know yet the answer to your question, whether we have come to a consensus or not. But I wasn't going to have and Franco Frattini and I said, if you're going to have a statement which is so cowardly as not to even mention Christians, then let's not have it at all. And so we're sticking out for a better one. Belarus, well, I'm very glad that I went to Minsk with my German colleague, because if we hadn't, today we could have been accused of not having tried every avenue in trying to civilize Lukashenko and trying to get him to obey European values. We made the extra effort. We went out of our way, risking criticism, because it's never nice for a politician to have a photograph with a dictator. You know, it always pursues you for years later. We knew the risks. We went out of our way and said, Mr. Lukashenko, have a free election, and here's a generous European offer. So we now, in clear conscience, can impose, and we have imposed, the toughest sanctions ever on Belarus because we were prepared to be so generous. And I think this is right. And if he goes further, we can go further too. How can Europe behave like a proper empire when we only have 2 million soldiers under our arms? I don't know, Mark can tell you in more detail, but I think Britain, in its imperial height, had what, 100,000, 150,000 soldiers? If only 2 million soldiers were actually real soldiers, capable of being deployed somewhere, capable of being used, Europe accounts for over 20% of the world's expenditure on defense. And as a former defense minister, it just breaks my heart how little capability we get out of all this money. 2 million soldiers is a huge army. But when it comes to operations, sending a battalion is a problem, or a helicopter. And I don't mean Poland, I mean all of Europe. That's the real problem, that we spend so much money and get so little out of it. And of course you understand that I'm joking when I say proper empire. We are very far from that. Is that all, or have I missed a page? Maybe just a couple of more. A gentleman from the German Historical Institute and Mr. Łukasz Pawłowski asked me about immigration and don't like my phrase, incompatible cultures. Well, to Mr. Pawłowski, I have this to say. You weren't listening to me very well. I was saying that this need for immigrants is, in my opinion, is a myth. Is our saying we are unwilling to change our social spending, our behavior, our retirement age. Therefore, we need immigrants to pay for those luxuries. So it's not a necessity, it's a choice. It's a choice not to change our behavior. On current behavior, I agree. Then mass immigration delays the day of reckoning. But as the Chancellor of Germany, and I hope you will allow me that I'm speaking somewhat in the vein of Chancellor Merkel and somewhat in the vein of Prime Minister David Cameron recently, who've said that multiculti has problems, okay? And we know that it does. Or at the very least, allow us to say that some costs follow, that mass immigration from linguistically and religiously different countries implies some costs, some even deferred by 2 or 3 generations, but they do exist. And so in this spirit of not being confined to the politically correct language and of speaking about actual problems that Europeans think about, I think this is the debate that we need to have. Because if we don't have it, the radicals have solutions. And there are ones that we don't like. So I defend my right to talk about the need for immigration and about shaping immigration. And as regards Poland, well, we have obvious sources of immigration if we decide that we need it. Number one, we would like to persuade our own young people to stay rather than leave. Number two, we would like the ones who have left to return. And number three, as a result of the 20th century, Poland has been moved around the map of Europe. So there are many people who are Polish who are beyond our borders, and if in the former Soviet Union, for example. And so what Germany did in the 70s and 80s by bringing Germans from the East, we could do too. And for us, that's the natural solution, because it also pays a historical debt that we have towards those people. Perhaps I should stop here.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you for your participation. Mark Leonard now, please.
Thank you very much. Just going to pick off a few, either because they were addressed to me or because I have some things to say which maybe don't necessarily repeat things that other people have said beforehand, but I'm not going to try and answer all the questions. First question was about the Europe's neighbours, and the backdrop is I think was our report on the spectre of a multipolar Europe, and you very rightly said that the analysis in the report was on stronger ground than some of the policy recommendations. I think both Ivan and I and the other authors will stand firmly behind the analysis in the report, but we suggested that one of the ways of dealing with this new instability was to think about creating a trialogue between the European Union, Turkey and Russia to talk about the big security problems facing our continent. And that is something which we express with much less confidence than the analysis. I think the problem that we were pointing to is very real, and that we do need to think of a way of developing a different relationship with these two emerging poles on the European continent. Personally, I'm very much in favour of Turkey joining the European Union, so are the other co-authors, but we're realistic that it's going to take a while for that to happen, and that in parallel with the negotiations, I think it does make sense for us to find new ways of talking to them. And with Russia, there is a new challenge of dealing with a post-BRIC Russia that is redefining its own foreign policy, and I think the Polish reset towards Russia is a good example of actually trying to change the relationship. Where does that leave the neighbours? I mean, the big challenge which we were trying to think about is how do we develop a modern way of dealing with a group of countries that have only recently regained their sovereignty, that are trying to create states that don't want to be sandwiched between great empires and don't want to be treated as flyover space between the big capitals on the European continent. As Europeans, we believe in their right to sovereignty and their right to control their own affairs. But the difficulty we have is that the only two models which people have used to think about them are the model of enlargement and enlarging the Cold War institutions like the European Union and NATO. And as I said, I'm a big fan. I believe in an expansive European Union. I want it to be as big as it can. But at the same time, not every single country on the European space is going to be in the European Union in the next 10 to 20 years' time. So are there other ways that we can manage our relationships with them, even if only as a temporary phenomenon? But the other model, which I think is much more problematic than that, is going back to a 19th century concert of great powers where you carve up the continent between ourselves. And we don't want to, that I think is the thing which ultimately we have to avoid at all costs. So what we were trying to do in that report was to think about whether there are ways of creating order on the European continent which will allow the European Union to remain united and to work effectively, which will give a bigger role to Turkey, which will allow Russia to become post-imperial, and which will give these countries some kind of control and security as they develop their states and their identities. And the term which we use to capture that is the idea of a concert of projects, but how you express that in institutional terms is a very big challenge. Second question, which wanted to talk a bit about is this question of legitimacy of the European Union, because I think that it is a very real question, but that the answers which people have given to it have tended to be wrong, because people have looked at the European Union as a state in the making and have therefore tried to give the EU legitimacy in the way that you give states legitimacy, by creating the European Parliament, having direct elections for MPs. Other people have talked for direct elections for the President of the Commission or the Council. Or we use basically 18th century political models to legitimate something which is not a state and never will be a state. The European Union is responsible for up to 50% of domestic legislation in the 27 member states that live within it. But it's the 50% that nobody cares about domestically. It's the 50% which they were happy to delegate to national technocrats, and which they're now trying to delegate to European officials who work with a series of national technocrats who make the decisions. And none of the issues which drive people to vote in national elections, and that's a difficult enough challenge getting them to vote anyway, are actually been passed up to the European level. So if you ask people what the top 5 issues are in British politics, for example, it's always the same issues. It's the economy and taxation, it's the delivery of health, of education, and of various other public services. None of these things are done by the European Union. The European Union creates a regulatory environment which allows nation states and regional governments and local authorities to deliver these sorts of things. So if you ask people to go and vote in elections which don't affect those things directly, it's very difficult, which is why you end up with such low turnout in the European Parliament. So there are, and I think we have this kind of sad situation where, on the one hand, the European Union is becoming more and more technocratic, because people are scared of public opinion. And on the other hand, that's creating greater and greater populism, both at a national level and more anti-European parties as a reaction to the technocracy, which then drives the technocrats to become even more technocratic and hide their treaties even more and to run away from referendums. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I don't think it's either having referendums on issues which are too complicated for people to understand, like these catch-all treaties which are designed to be very technical. And I don't think it's by giving more power to the European Parliament either. I wonder if it's about finding the issues which are really political and finding a way of having a proper debate about them. For example, when the euro was set up, there were some decisions which were made about the convergence criteria, which had massive macroeconomic implications, and we're seeing the consequences of them at the moment. And that's something where there was never a political debate. But that was not something which was controlled by the European Parliament, and which you could have done in the traditional way. Third question I was going to answer was about our relationship with the Council on Foreign Relations. We share a name with the Council on Foreign Relations. We haven't got a formal association with the Council, but we do work with all sorts of think tanks all over the world, with big Chinese think tanks, with Russian think tanks, and with American think tanks. We haven't so far worked with the Council, though we have worked with Brookings Institution and other kind of big American think tanks, as well as think tanks all over Europe. And so that's very much part of the way that we work. We want to work with partners everywhere. Maybe just 2 more questions. One's on Cathy Ashton. And I share very much the comments which your foreign minister started out with, which is that I think she has an impossible job. But I think that the real test of whether she is going to work and whether the institution is going to work is unfolding in front of us on the televisions at the moment. I think that the thing which defines leaders and statesmen and women are events and the way that we rise up to them. It wasn't until the Kosovo crisis erupted, that Tony Blair went from being an ordinary politician to thinking of himself as a global statesman. It wasn't until 9/11 that George Bush became the political figure that we all came to appreciate so much between 2001 and 2008. And I think that this really is the moment which is going to define whether the European Union is serious. Because you don't really know whether somebody, what someone counts for until they're willing actually to take some risks and to lose some things. And the battles that she's had so far with the European Parliament about the exact makeup of the External Action Service and with the member states about how many Polish or British or French people you had in the service were not the sorts of battles of which history is made. But I think what is unfolding in front of us in North Africa at the moment, in an area where the European Union has enormous resources and an area which has an enormous ability to affect our welfare, that is the stuff which will define whether the EU is a serious player in our region and therefore whether we can be a serious player in the world. And I think the circumstances which she faces are very difficult, with the vested interests of the different member states, the toxic historical relationships, a legacy of mistrust that's come about as a result of failing policies towards that region over a generation. But if she somehow manages to create a framework which will bring the huge power and the resources and the idealism of Europe's citizens and governments behind it, then I think we could see something serious emerging from that. And that brings me to the last answer which I wanted to make, which was about negative and positive integration. You asked whether the EU will only ever unite in response to crisis or whether there can be a positive vision for the EU. Well, I'd be quite satisfied if the EU unites in response to crises. I mean, historically, that has been the driving power of the European project. There's a beautiful quote from Paul Valéry who says that we hope vaguely, we dread precisely. And I think that, in a way, encapsulates the philosophy behind the European Union from the beginning. It was an escape from history. It wasn't designed around a beautiful vision of the future. But history was powerful enough, and the crises were powerful enough to drive the most remarkable and exciting geopolitical experiment in 500 years. And the worry now is not that we will only respond in response to crisis. The worry is that the crises are actually going to overwhelm us and that we won't respond. We will retire, we'll step aside. And as the Euro crisis started to erupt, that was what terrified me and many other people. I actually think that we are going to respond to crises, but let's not underestimate the difficulty of simply responding to crises and turning crises into a battle cry for the future of Europe.
Thank you very much. Ivan, you.
Thank you. We have reached the moment in the discussion in which the answers are going to be judged not on how good they are, but how brief they are. So this is why I'll try basically to combine all my answers around 3 questions, and many of the things that Mark said basically I agree with. The first is how not to be a commentator, and basically it comes very much also to the Ashton story. Probably they're going to be too much on a kind of common position here is, but she's not charismatic, which is quite obvious. On the other side, there is a kind of a attempt very much to underestimate. This was true for Merkel. Do you remember 1 year after Merkel came to Germany? This was a talk that Germany cannot have leadership anymore, that it's going to be a weak chancellor, all these comparisons with Kohl and others. I do believe that what Ashton is doing is basically the Chinese strategy of the peaceful rise. If you're going to come with a very strong person playing European Union foreign minister, he's going to be killed on the 6 months. Because neither of the big states are going to enjoy this. So from this point of view, you are obtaining power pretending how weak you are. And I do believe that Ashton is good at this. Secondly, I do believe that she is also quite good on something different, and this is coming with priorities and phrasing things in the way they're going to work for her. External service, neighborhood, but also strategic partnerships, basically understanding that European Union never can act on its own. The basic problem is with whom, what kind of problem you're going to decide. And here comes my comment on how not to be basically a commentator. Commentators are famous for 3 things. First, that they're commenting on everything. Secondly, that they're very much putting on brilliance and not basically want to be done. And thirdly, that their basically silence is meaningless. If a commentator is not going to say something about anything, you know that simply he was sick this week. I do believe part of the problem of the European Union is that we are trying to pretend of being global power, as a result of it we're making statements about things on which we don't have any leverage. I don't know how much money we're spending on Pakistan. I don't have the feeling that the European Union is a very powerful player there. If this is the case, one is constrain yourself. Speak where you believe that you have resources and interests there, but speak powerfully. Because let's give you one example. At the same time, when in Egypt there have been people on the streets and there were people killed, there have been also demonstrations in Albania where 4 people have been killed. I do believe that Albania is a place where the European Union should speak very powerfully. Because if you're not going to do anything in Albania, what matters what you're saying about Egypt? And I do believe this type of kind of even body language of European Union makes sense. Secondly, I don't believe it's only about one institution. Till now, European Union always has 3 modes of leadership. One was through the Commission, and during the enlargement it was very clear. The second was when the bigger member states played a role like the EU-Iranian task. And the fourth was one of the most interesting country lead. And this was the case, for example, of the Polish leadership during the Ukrainian Revolution. I do believe that with the new European Union policy on Russia emerges a 4th type of models which I find extremely fascinating. And this is 2 countries which are very much concerned, but have a different points of view of where the problem stands. What was the case with Germany and Poland, converging their positions and leading. Because there are some issues on which Europe is divided, and only the countries which really have been in an opposite position can come together. And I do believe from this point of view, I see much more the Polish change of mind with respect to Russia, not so much of Poland basically trying to evaluate differently the reality in Russia, but understanding that Russia's weakness can be as threatful as Russia's aggressiveness. And from this point of view, this type of a role of the strategic debate makes sense. This is why having a common strategic debate is so important. And from here, I'm moving to the problem of the narrative and all this, do we need a normative vision or basically we can overcome crisis? Honestly speaking, I never believed that there was a plan for Europe. Plan of Europe is the way we're telling the story of overcoming crisis when they're over. European Union looks at the realization of plan when you look backwards, but not when you look forward. But the major problem here is different. Foreign policy people normally are not interested in domestic politics. But what is changing in Europe very much is domestic politics. And it has a lot to do with the highest level of mistrust to the political, business, cultural elites. There is a new populist condition in Europe. And exactly because the foreign policy is the domain of the elites, it's very difficult to bring people together. And I do believe that one of the things that we are not doing very much is first doing this, and secondly trying to understand that there is a new very important political actor emerging. And this is what I'm going to call a threat on majorities. You have a political ethnic majorities in the countries, which because of their demographic imagination start to behave and feel like minorities. They believe that they're shrinking. They basically have the feeling that they don't have the power over societies that they run. Just to give you one figure, in the United Kingdom, there was a question being asked to the Englishmen and basically to foreigners. Do you believe that you can influence the policy of your government? Only 21% of the Englishmen declared that they believe that they can influence. 38% of the foreigners, immigrants, those not being born there. Of course, it's not the factual situation. There are 2 breeds here, but I do believe that Englishmen still have some say on their policy. But because of the trend, you have this, and I find this extremely kind of a interesting but real and dangerous development which can shape very much the way we're talking about foreign policy. And here I'm going to my last very short point on immigration. If Europe is divided between East and West, this is not because of many other things, even not so much because of legacies, but because of the fact that Western Europe is very much an immigrant Europe and Eastern Europe still lack immigration. Especially we lack immigration which is not coming from the traditional region. I do believe in the next 10 years, Poland is slightly younger, but places like Bulgaria, for example, on the demographic profile, we're worse than Italy, if you can imagine this. And as a result of it, there's going to be a flow of immigrants. We don't have a culture, how to do with this. We don't have a sense of guilt because we have never been a colonial power. We don't have much sense of solidarity. If people believe that the Roma are the worst treated parts of our societies, the latest survey in Bulgaria showed that the imagined immigrants from China and Vietnam, whom we didn't see yet, are even most rejected than the Roma. And this fear of the unknown, in my view, is going to be a major political factor. And this is going to happen exactly on this type of outskirts of Europe. And this, in my view, is going to be, in a certain way, the major challenge for Central and Eastern Europe. And from this point of view, when Minister Sikorski said, let's speak not politically correct, multiculturalism is dead, I don't know exactly what is dead and what is alive, but how the real alternative looks like. What else you are going to do? Are we going to shoot all these people coming from Tunisia and Egypt? How exactly you are going to stop them, especially if Mr. Gaddafi is not there to put them in a camp? So from this point of view, I do believe rhetorically it's much more easy to solve the problem than politically.
Thank you very much. Tim.
Thank you. Well, as someone once remarked, we've reached that point in the evening when everything has been said, but not yet by everybody. So I shall try and outdo Ivan Krastev on the Krastev criteria and just answer one question, but a large one. But before doing that, let me just say that when the minister said, I rather like this, that the EU should be no less democratic than the Vatican, it does occur to me that the Vatican has a somewhat restricted electorate. We do have a female high rep, after all. It may be some little time before we get a female Holy Father. Now, the question I wanted to answer came from Kultura Liberalna, and thank you for the emails that you send me so regularly, which is about legitimation, and this is the central question. Clearly, what story is it that we have to tell about this project? And for 50 years, although it was a project of the elites, Europe had overwhelming legitimacy. And if you look at the pro-European argument in every European country, they're very different in many ways, but they all have the same form. We have been in a bad place. That bad place could be Nazism for Germany, occupation for France, relative economic decline for Britain, communist dictatorship for Poland. We had plenty of bad places in the European past, and we want to go to a better place, and the name of that better place is Europe. And you know this very well in Poland because that was a classic shape of your pro-European argument. The problem comes when we're all in it. When we're all in that better place, when we're all in that Europe, and we begin to take it for granted. And that, I believe, is the problem of success the European Union has at the moment. And it amazes me that even in post-communist Europe, even in Latvia or Estonia or Lithuania, states that did not exist on the map of Europe 20 years ago, people kind of take it for granted. That you live in a free country, that on Friday afternoon you can jump into a plane and fly to Lisbon for the weekend. So that actually forgetting, the speed of forgetting, is part of the problem of legitimation. But that's no longer going to do the job. Global warming does not do the job either. It's not a mobilizing threat like the Red Army in the center of Europe. The rise of China doesn't do the job either. It's not like the Red Army on your own streets. There is no immediate mobilizing threat, and that's our problem. How would I make the case? I would make it in terms of what you mentioned, our citizens. I would say, people, to defend just the level of freedom we have achieved, the quality of life we have achieved, the level of social justice we have achieved, to defend our values, we really need to get our act together. Because if we don't, we will have less freedom, a worse quality of life, a smaller pension, a weaker welfare state, less social justice, and our own values will be in decline. Because I think there is that point about the issues of multiculturalism and immigration, that there is a set of values which I would identify with a certain post-Christian, post-Enlightenment culture of Europe, which are under threat. Let's not kid ourselves. And that is why we need to get our act together to defend our liberal values, our freedoms. And that's why we need a European foreign policy. And last point, this is not raison d'etat, a European raison d'etat, because there is no European État, and there will not be, at least in my lifetime. I suspect not even in yours. Nor do we need one. We don't need the United States of Europe to do what we need to do. Actually, the diversity of our states, which is the great glory of Europe, can also be an advantage. You'll remember from classical mythology the image of the hydra-headed monster. What we have the chance to be is to be a benign hydra, which realizes common purposes with 27 different heads, all looking slightly different and doing it in slightly different ways. 27 plus 1 heads, because there's also the EU head. And that's where we need to get, is to be that benign hydra, telling this new story about defending the basic freedoms and rights and quality of life of our own citizens. And I hope you in Poland will join us on that journey. Thank you.
Martti, you are the first, and quite naturally you will close our debate.
First of all, I have listened, my colleagues, we have been listening each other on many occasions, and I must say that I enjoyed every time as much as I have done tonight. Few comments, nevertheless, and they are my reaction not only to some of the questions, but also what my colleagues said, because I want to continue the debate with them as well. Mark, when you said that we are living in a post-Western world, I think we have to, it's a good debating point, but I think we have to define what do we mean. Because if you look what is happening in Middle East and North Africa at the moment, if I have understood, and I have been watching TV lately because of various reasons more than I normally do, what are these people wanting? They want to have the universal values, the democratic values which are important for us. I think it depends very much how we handle this whole process of change. I don't think, and I agree with what Timothy was saying about that we don't, the nature of EU. We don't want to become an imperial power. I think we are looking cooperation among the democracies of this world. And I was hoping that when one looks at the successful exercise of enlargement, when, for instance, Poland joined the European Union, I would think that countries who went through this process are the best ones to assist those countries who are actually going through these processes, provided they want our assistance. So I see a role for Poland and many other countries in this. That's then a friend of mine about Germany, when this was discussed, a friend of mine recently said to me that perhaps the way to keep Germany interested in EU is that rest of us have to start behaving more like Germans. And perhaps he was referring to the fiscal discipline of a society. But I leave this thought with you. Then I already answered the effect of the African Revolution on Europe. Immigration policy. I have participated when George Papandreou was foreign minister. I joined him on a number of meetings on immigration policy for EU. He was very courageous at that time to take those issues up. And I think we badly need to discuss a proper immigration policy. I say in my own country where the demographics influence the future to a very large extent, that I don't see a bright future for my country. We are a Finnish and Swedish-speaking country mainly. Some people in the north speak Sami. But if I compare us to Canada, for instance, where 2 international languages are offered for the best brains in the world, I think even if our climates are more or less the same, I think Canadians obviously have an advantage. I see a bitter competition among us, among 27 of us in the long term. And let's be prepared for that and have a civilized immigration policy, because we can't manage without that. There was a very important question about the values and interests. Who was the person who... yes, the lady over there. This is an issue that I think bothers all of us who have to make decisions, because it's a continuous fight. How do we get a civilized balance between our interests and our values? Because we can never believe that you could only make your decisions on the basis of values and forget your interests. But I think there is a civilized way of combining these two. And perhaps that's the best answer I can give to you, that perhaps we have to aim, and all of us who are interested in that the values are not forgotten, have to emphasize that. On the gentleman from Los Angeles, I don't think we ever saw any competitive attitude towards the American Council. At one stage, I and my colleagues remember it as well as I do, that when we decided that we would be called the European Council on Foreign Affairs, we were a bit hesitant whether our American cousins would sue us for using the name. But it was European Council on Foreign Relations. It shows that there was enough cooperation. And in the future, I think we see, as Mark was saying, we see much more possibilities for joint action on a number of things. Europe as a negative image. Bear with me, the younger ones in the audience. I'm 73 now. As long as I remember, I have been traveling in my profession 150 to 200 days a year. I still remember when, as a UN employee, I was traveling from New York via London to Africa, to Southern Africa. And I was dealing with Namibia particularly, from 77 to 1990. And I remember when I went to London and to immigration, and I never forget that there was a sign, aliens, which I was supposed to take. I must say that I like it much more when I can now call EU citizens. It makes an enormous difference, but perhaps for simple reason that I'm sentimental and old. But the mere fact that particularly UK is not part of Schengen, Euro, what a difference it has made for us who travel as much as I do. So it's much easier to accept the fact that yes, we are Europeans. And I remember when I stayed for 13 years in New York when I worked for UN. It was a continuous service then. I must say that I didn't feel so much Finn. I felt perhaps even more Nordic, but even more I felt that I was a European. and so did my wife. So Europe has meant, and as Timothy Garton-Ash was explaining, that we take easily granted all these positive developments have taken place during the last 20 years. It's a remarkable change and a positive change. But let's be critical. I remember I have to confess, and this is not terribly patriotic comment to end my presentation, that when the Newsweek came to the conclusion that my country was the best place in the world to live, when I saw that, I turned to my wife and said, "How lousy are the others?" For the simple reason that I was not underestimating all what we had achieved in my society. But if we would start thinking in Finland that we are living in a heaven, that there's nothing more to improve in our society, and there was a reference by him about the gender equality in certain circumstances. That's an area as well where we are not an ideal place, whatever we say. We are better than most, but not as good as we should be on these issues. So there are a number of issues that we have to become better. And if we think of European power, I think then we should not forget that we have to be able to provide our youngsters the best education in the world if we want to survive. And I think let's concentrate on those issues when we should not forget this, because if we don't do, we will not be a leading influence, positive influence in the world. Not a power, but leading influence in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just 3 short remarks to end up our discussion. First, I would like to thank you very much, Mrs. Rektor, Professor Katarzyna Hałaśnińska-Macugow, who welcomes us here at the University of Warsaw and accept our meeting to take place here. The second remarks, this is, I explained at the beginning why we organize debate on a very general subject, Europe and the world. There is another, private reason, it was why I suggested it. Many years ago, a friend of many of us, Bronisław Geremek, wrote a brilliant article exactly on the subject. The situation was very difficult. He was one of the founders of the ECFR, so in a way this is also homage to Bronisław Geremek. And the third remark is directly related to the problem of Vatican as an ideal. Professor Magda Środa, a friend of mine, and Professor Płatek interrogated me why there are only men here on the panel. And my answer is that this is unfortunate, that Emma Bonino, who is eminent member of the board of ECFR, and here only people, this is connected with the meeting of the board of ECFR. He was supposed to participate in the debate. Unfortunately, for political reasons, she couldn't come. But still, the problem of Vatican, the problem of the democratic policy, where the woman can be president, is posed, certainly. Thank you very much. This is what I wanted to say. I hope this is not the last, certainly this is the not last meeting, even big meeting organized by ECFR here. Thank you very much to panel and to you all.